challenging the anti-Catholic propaganda and setting the historical record straight. Today, on The Simple Truth, we consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong, chaste heart of St. Joseph. I'm your host, Jim Havens, and our guest today is Steve Weidenkopf. He is a Catholic husband, father, and historian, lecturer in church history at the Christendom College Graduate School of Theology in Alexandria, Virginia, author of many books, including the one we're going to talk about today, Canceled: 12 Catholic Heroes That History Turned into Villains. You can find it on Catholic Answers website, shop.catholic.com. Wherever you find books, always support your local Catholic bookstore if you can. You can also find his website, steveweidenkopf.com, and all of his books and resources there as well. But Steve, welcome back to The Simple Truth. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Jim. Thanks for having me back on the show.
Yes, very excited to have this discussion with you today and for you to bring some of what you have packed into this great book. We'll get to as much of it as we possibly can today. I did read every word of this book, highly recommend it. Again, Canceled is the name of it. We're going to get to it in just a moment. But before we begin, I want to remind you about iCatholic Mobile. It is the only Catholic mobile phone company in the U.S. today. When you subscribe to iCatholic Mobile, you do help fund the Station of the Cross. So check out iCatholic Mobile, iCatholicMobile.com. Steve, can you set us up with the scope of the book before we dive into some of the historical figures that you correct the record on?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, what I want to do is to help to show and illustrate that various groups throughout the church's history have used individual Catholics of the past as a way to attack the church. And so they've maligned, or in modern parlance, canceled these individual Catholics for a certain agenda that they have had in their own day and age. So what I do is break the book into 4 different attacks, if you will. So, and it's centered on these different groups. And within each of those groups, I highlight the 3 individuals per attack, to make up for the 12 Catholic heroes in general. So I look at such things like the Enlightenment attack, right? The Enlightenment intellectuals of the 17th and 18th century in Europe and how they attacked the church and who were the Catholic individuals they focused on in order to do that. Same thing then with the Protestant attack of the 16th century and even into the modern day and age. I look also at the secular attack and what the secularists will use, individuals they'll use in the church's life to attack her. And then finally, what I call the quote-unquote Catholic attack, or those who claim to be Catholic or call themselves Catholic, but don't really believe fully in the church's teachings or want to change the church's teachings in some sense. And so they have gravitated towards certain narratives and certain individuals and figures that they try to use as a way to further, again, their agenda of changing church teaching. So that's kind of the structure of the book itself.
Yeah, the challenge here is to see which of these figures we can lift out and talk about today. Again, there's 12 that the book really unpacks here, but I think we've got to begin with the fascinating true story of Marie Antoinette. She is featured on the cover of the book holding some cake, which we'll talk about. But today is actually the 236th anniversary of the infamous storming of the Bastille, which took place July 14th, 1789. Steve, tell us this fascinating true story of Marie Antoinette.
Yeah, absolutely. She's one of those figures, along with many others in the book, that are just grossly maligned, canceled, scapegoated even in the modern day and age. But she is unique in the book in that not only has this happened to her in historical memory, but it also happened to her during her own life. So many of the other people I cover in the book may have had some critics and whatnot during the course of their lifetime. But for most of them, the criticism and the canceling, if you will, occurred after their life. But with her, it's been a both and, if you will. So, the common narrative of Marie Antoinette was that she was this, rich queen of France who lived in an extravagant lifestyle, who cared nothing for the people of France during the height of their famine and financial difficulty at the end of the 18th century, which led to the revolution. And it's characterized by the phrase that she's, supposedly uttered, "Let them eat cake." And so I think think and everyone knows that story pretty much, right? Everyone has heard, when you hear Marie Antoinette, that's pretty much the first thing that comes to people's mind, which is why we used her as the cover girl, if you will, for the book, and her holding that piece of cake. But what's interesting is when you peel back the onion and look at this story in more historical detail and reality, we see that she was completely opposite of what everyone remembers her to be in the modern world. She was a very loving and caring individual. She was a great mother. She was a devoted Catholic throughout her life. She came to France at a very young age to marry the Dauphin, Louis, who ultimately became the Crown Prince, who ultimately became King Louis XVI. And she becomes Queen of France at a very young age as well. We're talking as a teenager. And so when she was young, and in her teen years and early 20s, before she actually had children, she did live a pretty ostentatious lifestyle, as one would imagine. She's in Versailles, she's throwing parties, she's eating lavish food. And although for her, even she did eat in moderation. She usually didn't prefer wine and mostly had just water. She ate less food than her husband, King Louis XVI. She did have some gambling issues, and she did love jewelry and fashion and high clothes and things like that. And so she, spent money extravagantly on those things when she was younger. But when she became a mother, that really changed her, and she began to take her faith life more seriously, and devoted herself to her family, and really put away some of this ostentatious lifestyle. Now, when it came to the end of the 18th century in France, they had a significant financial problem. In part brought about because France actually helped this fledgling nation on the other side of the Atlantic that was trying to break free from Great Britain, the United States of America. And the French indebted themselves in a war with Great Britain to help the United States achieve independence. And so after the United States had achieved its independence, or at least towards the end of that period of time, then France itself suffered a severe financial crisis, indebting themselves again in that war. Warfare is very expensive. And so people turned on the church, and people turned on the monarchy, and people began to blame the monarchy for the financial problems in the church, or in the France rather. People began to blame the church as well. And she was viciously attacked in the Parisian press. All kinds of horrible rumors spread about her, that she was, participating in all kinds of sexual immorality, lesbianism even, just all kinds of horrible things mentioned about her. And then eventually she and the royal family were imprisoned by the revolutionaries. In January of 1793, King Louis XVI was guillotined. Later on in that year, in October of 1793, she herself lost her life and was guillotined as well, victim of this anti-Catholic, anti-monarchy revolution in France. And then later on, actually, so during her lifetime, this whole phrase, "let them eat cake," was never, ever attributed to her. It was actually way after her death in the 19th century, when there was some political movement within France to restore the monarchy, where those who didn't want to do that began to foster this vicious lie about her, that she had uttered this phrase when it was brought to her attention that the people of Paris were starving. And she supposedly said, "let them eat cake." And that's what everyone remembers about Marie Antoinette today. But she never, ever said that quote. There's various historical understandings of where the quote may have originated. More than likely, it probably was said by a different queen of France, Maria Theresa of Spain, who was the first wife of King Louis XIV. But she died 72 years before Marie Antoinette was ever born. So the quote possibly, could be attributed to the French monarchy, but certainly not Marie Antoinette. In fact, she did the opposite during the revolution and during the height of the famine and financial difficulty. She actually paid for the establishment of soup kitchens and provided food for the poor people of Paris. So she loved her adopted country of France and loved her adopted city of Paris. And it's really just a vicious and calumnious lie that perpetuates in the modern world about who she was, and this phrase that she never uttered.
And why does this particular lie, why does this continue on to this day? What is the point of people wanting to perpetuate this lie and keep it going? Those that know perhaps that it's inaccurate, but they're using it for some sort of project of their own, some of their own goals. What are they actually after?
Yeah, great question. And so I center Marie in the part of my book where I talk about the secular attack, because it's really secularists who, although others will too, but it's mostly secularists who will use her story and use this quote and continue to perpetuate it, because they're rooted in a societal change and political change. And when the secularists came to power, really in the 19th century, or they began to become into power in various areas of Europe in the 19th century, rather, that's what they were focused on: is societal change, getting rid of the monarchy. Establishing, getting rid of the peasantry, if you will, in terms of the duties and loyalty that the peasants had to nobility, getting rid of the nobility, I should say highlighting the peasantry or elevating the peasantry and getting rid of the nobility. And so it was rooted in this societal / political context. And so today you still have people who, see a secular and temporal only vision of the world as being how the world should be governed, that faith should have no place in our political sphere, they should have no impact in our political discourse, our societal discourse. And so they will use, again, Marie and others that I highlight in the book as ways to illustrate whenever Catholics want to engage in public debate. They'll say, oh, well, remember people like Marie Antoinette, right? This Catholic queen of France that disliked people, that had no care for the people. This is what you get with a monarchy. This is what you get with a Catholic monarchy. So we don't want those things. We want a thoroughly secular government, a thoroughly secular society. So that's one part. The other part is that sometimes these myths exist because, people have an animus against the church, which just talked about. But also sometimes they persist because people just don't know any better, haven't received the information and the knowledge to know the historical truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this book's going to help you understand much more. Again, it's called Canceled, 12 Catholic Heroes That History Turned into Villains. Shop.catholic.com is where you can find it, as well as anywhere you find books. Steve Weidenkopf is with us, the author. He's going to be with us in just a moment. We'll be back from the break. But right at the end of the bit on Marie Antoinette, it talks about her execution, and it is worth reading. She really had quite a holy death. She was convicted on all counts, and she was arrested and sentenced to death. And she writes this final letter to her sister, illustrating her deep faith and love for Christ and the church. I wish I had time to share it with you, but you'll have to get the book or find it some other way. But really incredible. We're going to be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Steve Weidenkopf. He is the author of Canceled, 12 Catholic Heroes That History Turned into Villains, shop.catholic.com. And Steve, I'm going to give you a next swing to pick whichever figure that you want from the book and to share those stories with us. But first, I do want to go to the conclusion of the book, to something that you lay out that I think is very helpful there. You write, Catholics are susceptible to two erroneous responses to these anti-Catholic historical criticisms: an unflinching and uncritical triumphalism that highlights the good and ignores the bad of church history, and the ostrich approach of ignoring the controversy at best and implicitly accepting the false historical narrative at worst. The Catholic defender of church history must fight these extreme positions and seek the historical truth through knowledge, understanding the context of historical events, and recognizing that people in the past were men and women endowed with free will, which was sometimes exercised virtuously and sometimes not. So what we're after here is it's a seeking of the truth, understanding what actually did happen and what can we make of it, rather than trying to spin it in one direction or another. And with many of these figures, it's a mix of good and bad things, and to really understand what was bad and what was good, but not allowing these things to be distorted and then used for sort of nefarious purposes. Is that right?
Yeah, that's 100% correct, and I'm glad that you highlighted that, and because that's the whole point of my book, really, is to help Catholics understand the historical truth of these individuals that I cover, and to understand, even more importantly, the context in which they live, and begin to kind of, again, peel back the onion, if you will, on some of these historical myths that exist in the modern world and misinterpretations, because as one part, really, where does that come from? I mean, a lot of the history in the English-speaking world, especially in the last 500 years, has been presented from an English Protestant perspective. And so there's some truth, obviously, that's presented in that perspective, but there's also a lot of, shall we say, untruths or myths or narratives that have been perpetuated, especially in anti-Catholic myths and anti-Catholic, anti-church myths and anti-monarchy myths as well that we've talked about. And so what I hope is that Catholics will get out of this book is an understanding of who these people are and were and the times in which they lived, because we really can't understand why people acted the way that they did and the decisions that they made without understanding the times in which they lived, right? It's easy to sit back and kind of armchair historian, if you will, and criticize people for the actions or decisions that they made without understanding why they made them, right? It's not about necessarily justifying every action that they did, but it is about understanding and helping to explain why they did. And I purposely chose people in this book who have been maligned and canceled by historical groups who've attacked the church, but men and women who are not saints, right? We're not looking at people who are, have been, deemed worthy of being on the liturgical calendar of the church, if you will, who we know are in heaven with God and interceding for us. These are just average, ordinary Catholic men and women like you and I who lived their lives in most cases as best as they could, made good decisions, bad decisions, lived virtuously, and at times sometimes did not. And so instead of just believing the kind of general lie or application of lies that are given to them and just the kind of the caricature that we believe about them, to try to dig a little deeper and understand who these people actually really were, historically speaking, and in real life.
Yes, yeah, very good. And so I guess which one of these historical figures would you most like to share with us today?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And I would like to talk about Guy Fawkes, actually. So he is an individual, an Englishman. Many people probably don't know who he is, unless you spent some time in England, maybe, or you have a great love and interest in English history. Or perhaps if you've seen I think it was 2006 movie V for Vendetta with Hugo Weaving and Natalie Portman in it. Or you've seen the caricature mask of his face, which modern day certain groups, usually anti-establishment groups, Antifa, these kinds of people, will use his mask and wear them in various riots and whatnot. And so many people kind of have that sense of who he is, but don't know who the real person is. So I placed Guy Fawkes within the section of the book on the Protestant attack, because it is Protestants who have, English Protestants in particular, who've maligned his memory and who have created this myth around him. And so to give some background on who he was an individual who was born in York in northern England in the 16th century, and then he was born Protestant, but eventually converted to the faith. And York was a town that had a large Catholic recusancy population. So for those who don't know, recusancy was the name given to Catholics living in Elizabethan England in the 16th and 17th, late 16th, early 17th centuries, who refused to attend Church of England services. So they were known as recusants. And many of them were imprisoned, many of them were ultimately executed by Elizabethan authorities, many were fined and suffered great persecution. And there was one individual in particular in the city of York, a woman by the name of Margaret Clitheroe, who's a saint of the church, who was murdered by the Elizabethan authorities because she hid priests in her home and taught the faith to her children. Guy Fawkes was in York at the time of Margaret Clitheroe's martyrdom, and it's understood that he converted to the faith because of her witness, because of the blood of that particular martyr of Margaret Clitheroe. So he eventually leaves England, becomes a soldier. He fights actually for Catholic Spain on the continent for a period of time, gaining a lot of military skill and art, especially in gunpowder, in mining, and in explosives. And so when he comes back to England, the English Catholics are greatly suffering during Elizabeth's reign. And some of them, including this one minor nobleman by the name of Robert Catesby, who decide that they've had enough and that the hope that when Elizabeth died, and King James came to the throne, known as King James I in England. He was also King of England, King James VI of England. When he came to the throne, the hope of Catholics, English Catholics, was that James would repeal these anti-Catholic Elizabethan laws and would be more favorably disposed to Catholics, as he had been in Scotland. But that hope was soon dashed, if you will, because soon into his reign, James reinforced all of the anti-Catholic Elizabethan legislation. So people like Catesby and others decided that the time time of waiting for the monarchs to be, to approach Catholics in a peaceful situation, to resolve this in peaceful ways, was over, and it was not going to occur. And so you had to take more radical action. And so Catesby and several other conspirators, 13 ultimately total, including Guy Fawkes, hatched a plan that came to be known as the gunpowder plot. And what their plan was to stockpile barrels of gunpowder underneath Parliament building. And when Parliament then sat for the opening session in early November of 1605, they would then light the gunpowder barrels, put them on, light the fuse to the gunpowder barrels and blow up Parliament building. And in so doing, because it was the opening session of Parliament, you had the king, you had the royal family, you had all of the bishops of England as well, all the nobility, you have the House of Lords, you have the House of Commons as well. So you had the entire English government, if you will, present in Parliament at that time. So the idea was of these Catholic conspirators was to blow up Parliament, ultimately, obviously, kill all the members of the English government, and then institute a Catholic government and reinstitute a Catholic monarch to England to end this religious persecution. And so Guy Fawkes was ultimately the triggerman. He's sometimes portrayed as being the leader of the gunpowder plot. He wasn't. That was Catesby, but he was a significant component of it, a significant element of it, and he was the one who was to light the fuse. However, on the early morning hours of November 5th, he was actually discovered by the royal officials, brought before the king, asked why he was going to light these barrels of gunpowder on fire and kill everyone in Parliament. He boldly told King James because King James was a heretic. And he was persecuting Catholics. Ultimately, these other conspirators were found out. Many of them died in a battle, if you will, a conflict between the royal forces. And ultimately, Guy Fawkes himself was tortured to give up their names and was ultimately executed by being hanged. He was also supposed to be drawn and quartered, but he died immediately upon his hanging. So as a result of that, when news of this foiled gunpowder plot kind of reached out through London, the English people, the Londoners in particular, celebrated the fact that England had been, or that the king had been saved, that Parliament had been saved, that this Catholic plot had been discovered and had been successfully, rebuffed, if you will. So they lit bonfires and in celebration and in joy. And so this became, November 5th became known as Bonfire Night. And ultimately, Parliament passed an act of legislation called the Thanksgiving Act. It also had some other names, but it mandated that every year, annually on November 5th, there were to be celebrations for bonfires and fireworks and whatnot to commemorate the foiling of this gunpowder Catholic plot, if you will. And it was an English law all the way until the middle of the 19th century that this was mandated, annually commemorated. And it morphed over time into having not only bonfires, but fireworks and also burning of effigies of Guy Fawkes. And then later on, when the celebration made its way over to North America with English colonists, they swapped out Guy Fawkes and burning him an effigy for the Pope. And so November 5th became this very virulent, English anti-Catholic annual celebration that continued all the way into the modern age. And it's still celebrated in England today, although many of its kind of anti-Catholic historical elements have been subdued, but it's still celebrated, and his memory is still maligned. And so in the book, what I try to show is not that, Guy is some kind of, hero or some kind of, person that, encouraging Catholics to emulate, obviously, in terms of, blowing up government buildings or whatnot. That should not occur. But to understand him a little bit more than just a caricature that's presented of him, try to understand why did he do what he did, and to, again, not justify it, but explain it. And he and others like him, Robert Catesby and the other conspirators, really were at the end of their rope. Robert Catesby himself had been arrested or had been fined multiple times for not going to Church of England services. He had been indebted as a result of that. He was under serious financial pressure. These men really had just been pushed to the brink for their faith, and it made them desperate men who believed that they needed to engage in desperate measures.
Yeah, and it is interesting, as you write at the end of this portion, how the 1988 DC Comics graphic novel V for Vendetta is based on this story. And then, as you mentioned earlier, it turned into the 2006 movie as well. And most of the modern day protesters who use the caricatured likeness of Guy Fawkes more than likely have little to no understanding who the real Guy Fawkes is and his fellow gunpowder conspirators were, and why they embarked on such a dramatic and violent plot against the English crown. So yeah, just kind of interesting that the story kind of lives on and people just sort of forget where it even comes from. But very interesting history, and I think part of helping to understand. So yeah, the context of the time, the desperate times, the desperate men that we're talking about here, and these times that they were living in, it really is highlighted. I think when you unpack the death of Saint Margaret Clitheroe, there, that was the inspiration for Guy's conversion. And I mean, just hearing the tales of these martyrs during this time in anti-Catholic England, for her, the particular death was the martyrdom was being killed by pressing. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, sure. That form of execution in England at the time was quite severe and quite barbaric, to be honest with you. So the accused, or the convicted rather, who had received this particular penalty, this death penalty sentence, would be stripped naked, laid on the ground, and then have a plank placed on top of them like a door, and over time would have a series of weights leading up to almost 800, 900 pounds placed on them that would crush the person over time and slowly suffocate them. Just a horrifically horrible way to die.
Yes, yeah, and we do get the history in leading up to all of this. Mary Tudor, Queen of England, is another historical figure that is highlighted in the book. Again, canceled, 12 Catholic heroes that history turned into villains. Maybe we could talk about her next. I think that's another fascinating person, fascinating story that, has been widely distorted, and it's good to know the truth on. But yeah, what times those were in anti-Catholic England, violent times that, the politics kind of shifted back and forth, but seemed much worse when the Protestants kind of had things. But we'll talk about it. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Steve Weidenkopf. You can find more about Steve and his good work over at steveweidenkopf.com. We're also talking about his book, Canceled, in particular today, 12 Catholic Heroes That History Turned into Villains, shop.catholic.com. You can find it there. And Steve, when we go to the story of Mary Tudor, Queen of England, I remember when I was first learning about this history some years ago, and this battle between Catholicism and the Protestant Revolution takes off, and you have King Henry VIII, and that whole particular saga that you do lay out in the book here, but then that really is just it kicks off so much, this sort of back and forth, and so much revolves around Mary Tudor, and also her sister Elizabeth. And I found myself, when I was first learning this history, kind of rooting for the Catholics in power for her to get back in power, which she does, and then hoping that this is going to end the persecution, and this is going to be a very good thing. And but she when she got back into power, she held it for a short time, a span of not that many years, and then her half sister gets in there, and then so the Protestants basically win out, and her half sister's in there for quite a long time, and the persecution of Catholics, it really ramps up and is terribly violent. And yet it's Mary Tudor who's known as Bloody Mary, and that's something that kind of one of those things, sort of like the Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake, sort of like the one thing somebody would know maybe is about Mary Tudor. Oh, Bloody Mary. Yeah, okay, I know who that is, or I've heard that before. But it really is completely inaccurate, completely unfair. And I guess, is it kind of a result that, the Protestants kind of won out, and then they were the ones that shaped the history? I wonder what would have happened if the Catholics would have won out there politically, and how that would have gone. But that's not the case. But please share your thoughts, Steve, and a bit of this story with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you aptly compared the two, Marie Antoinette and Mary Tudor, two women, monarchs who just been unjustly maligned and canceled in history, right? And Mary, unlike Marie, though, was during her lifetime, wasn't really criticized at all for her reign. She was a much beloved queen, although as you mentioned, she reigned briefly, only 5 years in the middle of the 16th century. But she Mary was a woman who was known by her subjects to have suffered greatly during the time of her father's reign and his whole divorce situation with him and Mary's mother, Queen Catherine of Aragon, who was very much beloved by the English people as well. And, they knew the story. They knew that during her lifetime, when Henry, illegitimately divorces Catherine and then marries Anne, despite the papal prohibition against it and the church defending his bond with Catherine, he doesn't listen. He has Parliament pass all these pieces of legislation which declare him to be the supreme head of the Church of England, among other pieces of legislation. And then he puts Mary away when Anne Boleyn is pregnant with and gives birth to Elizabeth. Mary is kind of shoved aside, no longer even allowed to call herself Princess Mary or to be referred to as Princess Mary even. She was physically separated from her mother. She didn't see her mother. And even towards the end of Catherine's life, when Catherine knew she was dying, she reached out to Henry and asked Henry if she could see Mary one more time before she died, if he would grant her that wish. And King Henry VIII refused. All right, even at the death of his wife, didn't move his heart to allow his former wife, if you will, really truly his wife, and his daughter Mary to see each other again. So she greatly suffered during her life. She was thrown out of the line of succession by her half-brother Edward VI when he came to the throne. He was below the age of legitimacy, if you will, and so he had to, before the age of maturity rather, and he had to have a regency council that ruled England. And it was during his reign under Edward VI that England really moved completely fully into Protestantism, embracing all these different political or Protestant heresies as well, and where the church in England began to really change from a Catholic Church that was at least in schism under Henry VIII in terms of recognizing papal authority and not really embracing Protestant heretical teachings. That was true under Henry towards the end of his reign, but under his son, Edward, that changes completely through the actions of Archbishop Cranmer. Edward allows the church, if you will, or moves the church in England into full-blown heresy. And Mary, even during the course of that time, despite heavy pressure from her brother and his royal officials, refused to agree to these changes, refused to embrace the heresy, continue to have Mass celebrated in her residence, and despite repeated attempts to force her to give up her faith, she refused and remained steadfast in her faith. Eventually, then, her brother dies. Parliament initially recognizes Lady Jane Grey as queen, so even then, she's not recognized as the queen, but soon Parliament changes its mind. Many noblemen lined up behind Mary, as did the people, and so Mary becomes Queen of England, and she makes it her point, if you will, that the main focus of her reign is to restore the Catholic faith to England. She really legitimately believed that God had placed her on the throne, allowed her to become monarch against all these different odds and against all the kind of things and obstacles that were stacked up against her, to where she never really should have been queen or monarch. But then she was given the opportunity. She became the Queen of England, and so she recognized that was, God's plan for her was to restore this, to utilize that position to restore the faith. So she does. She embarks on this catechizing of the English populace. She brings in her cousin, Cardinal Pole, who helps her restore the faith in England as well. And she keeps some of the bishops who were during the reign of her half-brother Edward. She also appoints new men to be bishops as well as England, who begin to fully catechize the people once again. Because during Edward's time, many things had changed. The liturgy had completely changed. The rite of ordination for priests had changed. Many things had, just really become Protestant and not Catholic. And so there was a huge effort that needed to be engaged in to restore the faith. Now, there were people in England who were not happy with Mary and her becoming queen, and not happy that she was reinstituting or restoring the faith in England, especially groups in London. And these were people who were Protestant and who wanted to get rid of her and put her half-sister Elizabeth on the throne, who had been raised Protestant from birth, knowing that then Elizabeth would undo all of the things that Mary was doing to restore the faith. And so there were many different plots made against against Mary's life, including one particular rebellion, Watts Rebellion. And that forced her really to kind of see this threat to her crown and to her reign and to the restoration of the faith. And she had to address that. So she instituted some royal investigations into those who held Protestant belief, and they were then brought before the church and investigated through this canonical process of evaluating whether they were heretics or not. Many of them were given, most of them, all of them were given multiple opportunities, I should say, to recant and to repent. Many were arrested and were interrogated, if you will, in terms of being questioning, not torturing. And then they were released and then told not to further their Protestant heretical beliefs, but then continued to do so and had to be rearrested again. And so many of them ultimately then were by the state, were given the death penalty, because during this time, which was true throughout Europe, heresy was both a secular crime and an ecclesiastical crime. Right? And so in the secular world, heresy was seen as a threat to the realm, to the national security, we would say that term. And so it was a capital crime. And so those who were convicted of heresy under secular law faced the death penalty. And so there were many people, is mostly in England during her reign, who were executed. But the best source we have is a Protestant source from Guy Fawkes writing at this time or shortly after the reign of Mary. And he estimates that there were, I think if I remember correctly, around 200 or so, less than 300 people who were executed during the course of Mary's reign for their Protestant belief. And again, multiple times they had been arrested, given opportunities to recant, repent, and to be brought into the church and communion, and refused to do so, and were a threat to her particular reign. And so it's not even during her lifetime, not even during the lifetime of Elizabeth, her half-sister who reigned after her, who actively persecuted the church, as we just saw when we talked about Guy Fawkes before the break, who killed hundreds of Catholics in violent ways, simply for being Catholic, not because they necessarily were trying to overthrow her or whatnot, just because they were Catholic. Elizabeth had these people, Catholics, martyred during her reign. But it's not even during her reign, the reign of Elizabeth, was Mary known or referred to as quote unquote Bloody Mary. No one really even saw what she was attempting to do in terms of those Protestant rebels, if you will, or threats to her reign, as being any different than what Elizabeth was doing. So it's actually not till you get to the 19th century, really, where English Protestant history begins to look back on that time and elevates Elizabeth to this highly exalted status. And in a way to do that, they then denigrate really the memory of Mary and begin to place on her this moniker of bloody. So that even now, today, again, most people don't know much about Mary Tudor at all. She didn't reign very long, only a 5-year reign. They might know that she was a Queen of England, but the one thing they do know and will always mention is the fact that she was somehow quote unquote Bloody Mary.
Yeah, it's very interesting, too, because this whole cycle of violence was kicked off by King Henry VIII. I mean, if anybody is maybe going to be called, maybe it should be Bloody King Henry VIII. I mean, responsible for the martyrdoms of St. Thomas More, St. John Fisher. And look, we've got that historical story about how, look, he just said, I'm going to start my own church because I can't get the annulment that I want. So I'm just going to say, well, the church is now mine in England. The Anglican church begins, and I'm going to give myself the annulment because I'm the one that's in power. I mean, this is historical fact. This is what happened. This is how this is the birth of the Anglican church. And so we have that story. And yet at the same time, people try to take the story of Constantine that you write about in the book and try to say, well, no, the Catholic Church, this is where the Catholic Church started with Constantine, Council of Nicaea. And it's no, actually, the Catholic Church started with Christ. Jesus started it. You can go back to Matthew 16:18 and understand it, and even read the church fathers leading up before Constantine to see, okay, this is the Catholic Church, this is the Catholic faith very clearly. So that attack where they try to to say the Catholic Church begins with Constantine, that's erroneous, but we actually do have the beginning of all these Protestant churches. We can trace them all back, and we've got the accurate stories, and yet somehow they remain Protestant, and they're not, for even people that understand the history, and I think a lot of people don't understand the history. If they did, maybe they would understand it and say, maybe I ought to become Catholic. It's the one true church if they look back through the history. But for those that do know the history and they stick with Anglicanism, for instance, I would think that would be difficult to do. But do you have any thoughts on that matter?
Yeah, I do. And as you were talking, what came to mind, it was the famous quote of Cardinal, Newman, Henry Newman, who said, to know history is to cease to be Protestant, which was for him, was very important for him in particular. So I think that, it's a couple of different factors, right? I think there are those, I have run into and encountered people who look at church history or look at the writings of the church fathers in particular, and they try to interpret them in a Protestant light and in a non-Catholic way, which seemingly, seems very difficult to do, but they find ways in which to do it, right? Which is somewhat, and this is not to be flippant, but is somewhat kind of in keeping with the Protestant way of doing things and looking at things, especially in terms of Scripture. It's not the content unity of Scripture, the whole of Scripture. It's picking certain verses out here and there and interpreting in your own way to match whatever point you want. They do the same thing happens with history, and the same thing happens with the writings of the Church Fathers. So I think that's part of it. And I think the other part is even more true, is that most Protestants, most people, many Catholics even, to be honest, we don't know our history, and we don't know the writings of the Church Fathers. And so we allow ourselves to just kind of know the caricature or the modern kind of main narrative without investigating it ourselves. And so we just accept what's been given to us without really investigating and researching it and coming to a greater understanding of the truth through our own research and following sources that are accurate and authentic, and paint a real picture of who people were in the past.
Steve Weidenkopf is with us. We're going to be right back with a final segment talking about his book, Canceled, 12 Catholic Heroes That History Turned Into Villains. And we're setting the record straight here, and Steve's helping us to do that. But I highly recommend you get the full treatment with the book. You can get Canceled by going to shop.catholic.com. Go to your local Catholic bookstore, wherever you get books. And when we get back, there's a lot of different ways we can go. So come Holy Spirit, we'll see. But there's so much in here that Steve really corrects. The Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, even the Second Vatican Council, a fair, accurate treatment. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here. Steve Weidenkopf is our guest today, talking about his book, Canceled, 12 Catholic Heroes That History Turned Into Villains. Shop.catholic.com. And it really is difficult to pick so many great stories, so many great historical figures that Steve sets the record straight on in this book. But I guess we'll let Providence decide. And once again, we'll look at the dates. And yesterday happened to be the anniversary, mark the 155th anniversary of a vote on the First Vatican Council document, Pastor Aeternus. So let's go to Pope Blessed Pius IX. Steve, what can you share with us about him?
Yeah, so Pope Blessed Pius IX, quite an interesting figure, and I think one of the most important popes, truthfully, in the last several centuries of church history. And many people just don't know much about him and his story, and I think they should. One little interesting data point of him: he does have, outside of St. Peter, the longest reign as pope in church history. It was 32 something years, so quite a significantly long period of time. And so a pope that we should really know an awful lot about. And he comes to the throne as the chair of St. Peter, if you will, in the 19th century at a time of great change. And so, like Marie Antoinette, I place him in the secular attack, if you will, because, as I mentioned earlier in the show, this was a period of time where you had many different groups within Europe who were advocating for social change, for political change. This was the rise of different political thoughts in terms of socialism. This is the time when Marx and Engels and others are living and writing and trying to engage in all kinds of societal and political change. In the year 1848, for example, when Pius IX was Pope, you have significant revolutions, political and social revolutions, all throughout most of the major countries in Europe, brought about by this, industrial revolution in part, where you have a change of European lifestyle from a predominantly agrarian lifestyle to a more urban-based lifestyle. You have people moving to cities. You have bad working conditions. You have children working even. You have people working very long hours for little pay, these kinds of things, right? So just all kinds of social and political revolution. And into that mix comes Pius IX. And not only were there these political and societal changes, but there were many who were advocating for the unification of countries, where previously had been broken up, if you will, into various kingdoms and principalities. There was a move, especially in German areas, as well as in Italy, for a unified and unification process. And so in Italy, that was very much true. There were all these different Italian nationalist groups who wanted Italy to be united. And that was difficult to do because in the south, you had the Kingdom of Naples, and you had in the north, most of northern Italy was the Kingdom of Piedmont, but also many northern Italian areas were controlled by Austria. And then in the center of Italy, the central Italy, you had the Papal States, where the Pope himself was actually a temporal ruler, was an actual, individual who, had land and was the governing authority for that territory, and had been since the 8th century, since the donation of Pepin. And so, the many groups in Italy during the time wanted to, they had different understandings of Pius IX and his role. Some wanted him to support Italian unification and become, the kind of president, if you will, not the chief executive, but the kind of ceremonial head of state, if you will, for a unified Italy. And then there were others who wanted to get rid of the Pope entirely in terms of his temporal holdings and have him be just a spiritual ruler and not have any control over actual territory or be any kind of governing entity. And so he became Pope during a very difficult and tumultuous political situation. And he initially, it seemed, kind of favored some of these more quote unquote liberal reforms, and was kind of approached these from a modernish perspective, if you will. He did things different than previous popes. He began to allow some modern technology and modern, legislation and penal reforms and criminal law reforms within the Papal States. And so there were many people in Italy who thought, oh, this is a quote unquote liberal pope. He's going to embrace all these new ideas, and he's going to unify Italy and be the lead of it, and he's going to walk away from some of his authority in the Papal States. And so ultimately these revolutionary groups, especially in 1848, there's riots in Rome. His prime minister that he had appointed to rule the Papal States in his name was horribly assassinated, and then soon after his secretary was actually shot. A bishop secretary of his was also shot and killed during these riots. It got so bad that Pius had to leave Rome and fled to Naples and stayed several years in Naples. And so when when the revolution turned violent, Pius recognized that he really couldn't support any of these ideas that they were fostering. It was one thing to advocate for change politically and do so in nonviolent ways, but once it turned violent, he recognized he could not really work with these individuals or these groups at all. So he asked Catholic powers of Europe to come and to secure Rome itself. And so the French responded, sent troops down to Rome, and they would be in Rome then from the middle of the 18th century all the way to the end of the 19th century, leaving in 1871 during the time of the Franco-Prussian War, right at the time of the First Vatican Council, as you mentioned, that document, Pastor Aeternus, that had been promulgated from it. And that suspended the work of the council, right? So Pius IX had to suspend the council indefinitely. It only produced 2 documents, although very important documents, both of them. And technically, the First Vatican Council wasn't actually officially closed until the 20th century by Pope St. John the 23rd, in anticipation of opening the Second Vatican Council. So, we always say things sometimes take long in the church. That's just one kind of historical example of that. But Pius IX was a beautiful man. He had a great sense of humor. He, really loved his people and was a great pastor as well. But when in the late 19th century, when he had to cancel council, or had to suspend the council. And when the French troops left to go back to France to fight in the Franco-Prussian War, then these Italian nationalists and unifiers came in and they took over the Papal States, and he wasn't able to, he had no major army, did have an army, but he didn't want them to engage in massive bloodshed. And so he really lost all this papal territory of the Papal States that had been in possession of the papacy since the 8th century. And as a result of that, he stayed inside the Vatican. He called himself a prisoner of the Vatican, didn't leave the Vatican Hill and St. Peter's Basilica and the surrounding areas. And that led to this kind of weird diplomatic question of who is the Pope and what is his territory and what's his relation to this new unified nation of Italy. And all that wasn't really resolved until the 20th century, until 1929, with the establishment of the Lateran Treaty under Benito Mussolini's government. Actually, that treaty creates then the modern day nation state of Vatican City, the 108 acres that the Pope has and holds as a head of state in the center of Italy. So during his lifetime, he was a Pope of just tremendous change and had to really guide the church through that tumultuous seas of political and social upheaval.
Incredible. And I just want to sneak this in real quick when it comes to Pope Venerable Pius XII and the attacks on him with respect to World War II and the Nazis and not doing enough and all of that. This is a great portion of the book where Steve writes, after the war, individual Jews and many Jewish organizations expressed profound gratitude to Pius XII for his heroic activity and the actions of many Catholics who helped Jewish people escape the clutches of the Nazis. Isaac Zoli, the chief rabbi of Rome during the war, converted to the Catholic faith and took the name Eugenio, which was the birth name of Pius XII, in part due to the witness of the Pope and Catholics during the war. Zoli considered Pius XII a great friend to the Jewish people and remarked, no hero in all history was more heroic than Pope Pius, and his readiness to defend the children of God. Goes on to say, the Jewish historian Lapide estimated that the actions of Pope Pius XII and the Catholic Church during the Second World War resulted in the rescue of 860,000 Jewish people from the Nazis, representing 37% of those who survived the war. So this is one case where the historical record, what is true, is so radically, drastically different from these lies and attacks that are put out there. But so much in this book. Christopher Columbus is in here. The church's teaching on slavery is in here. Just an incredible book. Again, canceled 12 Catholic heroes that history turned into villains. And you can get it at shop.catholic.com. Steve Weidenkopf, thank you so much for being with us. You're a wealth of knowledge, and really appreciate you being with us today.
Yeah, appreciate it, Jim. Thanks so much. God bless.
God bless you. And you can learn more about Steve, all his good work over at steveweidenkopf.com. But really amazing stuff. And so, yeah, you see the virtues, you see the sins, you see all of it on display throughout human history. But the fact is that we want to be faithful to Jesus and his Catholic Church. The teachings are true. The more faithful we are, the better we're going to be. God bless you all.